Hi, we continue in Luke 5 today, following the scene of the flipping of Levi the tax collector to being on Jesus' side. I had to mention that to a couple of folks, the using of the word flipping, like he's taking someone who was a witness for the prosecution and turning him into a witness for the defense. And they laughed at that, but I think that's exactly what's going on here. We might tend to think in the language of conversion and other religious language of what's going on here, like falsely thinking this is going from being a quote-unquote Jew to being a quote-unquote Christian. But what really is happening is that Jesus is convincing Levi, with hardly any need for argument, to drop what he's doing as an exploitative tax collector on behalf of the Romans and oppressing his own people to following Jesus. So we have that accomplished, and now we continue with the scene where Levi celebrates by giving this great banquet. So let's look at a couple of things we've been looking at in chapter 5 and in this scene in particular to get us up to speed of these verses from 29 to 32. So we've been following these scenes in Luke 5, and we're on, of course, this one at the bottom down here. As we've been noting throughout this unit, Luke just juxtaposes these scenes one with another rather than connecting them geographically or chronologically to what follows or what preceded, as we saw in chapter 4, although this one is slightly different. After this, he went out, and so it does seem to be continuing from this previous scene. And evidence of that is the Pharisees are there again, or still there, as the case may be, described as Pharisees and scribes rather than Pharisees and teachers of the law. But as we looked at a few videos ago in relation to the opponents of Jesus in Luke's gospel, these may be the same people, or at least people with the same ideological position vis-a-vis Jesus and the Torah, as we'll see here. So that's part of the setup, and we also are noting how Luke has taken his source, Mark, for the story and changed it. And we're only going to focus on the verses up to 32 here. We'll look at the rest of it in the next video. So just to note a couple of things here. One is that Luke uses the word for complaining, and we'll look at the Greek of that in just a moment, which creates an Exodus echo of the Israelites grumbling or complaining against Moses and Yahweh in the wilderness. And he also adds the call to repentance, to not just call the righteous but sinners to repentance. The Luke word that we heard earlier when John the Baptist called tax collectors, soldiers, and all to repentance, to metanoia, to that different mind that is shaped around the way Jesus has them see the world rather than the way the empire has them see the world. So that's our setup there. And we're also noted that this is the first of the set of 5 meal scenes set in a chiasm, as well as the first of 8 meal scenes throughout Luke's gospel. And we also noted last time that 4 of the 5 meal scenes here involve the Pharisees. Either at Pharisees' houses, like we see here, here, and here, or Pharisees looking on this banquet in Levi's house. And then we'll see another meal scene with a tax collector in his house, and then the Last Supper and the road to Emmaus there. Finally, what we looked at last time that I want to bring forward here is how chapter 5 has been showing Jesus' ministry of Jubilee being fulfilled in each of the ways that we looked at last time. I won't go over that again here, but this chart is posted on the website, so you can look at it in more detail. And we also finally followed how Levi, I'm suggesting here, represents the Levites, and I showed the chain of relationship from the beginning of Levi, literal Levi's birth in Genesis 29:34, to the various roles of the Levites in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as assistants to priests or as priests, but perhaps more ominously as the folks that Moses can call upon to strap on their swords to stop the people who had built the golden calf in the wilderness. So the final link we made was to the passage from Malachi 3:1-3 that you see at the bottom of the screen here, with this link of katharizo, the verb for purifying or cleansing, that connected the leper scene up here with the Levi scene here. So I'll continue with the meal scene on the right side as we go through the verses, and then we'll look at some more things as we go. So one reason I want to leave that up there is you can see from the chiasm on the right that in the first black part and the last black part, both of them use the word doken for a great banquet. So that's framing this here. And this is a rare word used in the New Testament, but it implies a very large celebration. So not surprisingly, Levi, as a tax collector, had gotten quite wealthy as a result of this, and he can host this great banquet banquet for what Luke describes there in the verses, a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. So there's a couple things we need to look at. The standard meal setting here for people with some money was at a triclinium. And here are a couple of images of them. Here's an archaeological image from a summer triclinium, which is when the weather was warm and people could eat more outside. There are also winter triclinium that would be, of course, inside. And here's a 3D model of one that gives us a little more detail of something larger, that perhaps the kind of size of what Levi's suggested as having here from Luke's description. So it's a large crowd of tax collectors and others, and they're not sitting. In fact, the word here, katakemenoi, means to lie down or lie on your side, which is the image you see there of what people do at triclinium. So this is suggesting perhaps for Luke's audience not just a Jewish meal, but a symposium. And a symposium had a number of elements to it. In the world before the internet or TV or any other forms of entertainment that could be beamed into one's house, if one had the money, one could hire people to be entertaining, often a speaker. Sophists were often hired for that reason, not to bring in conversation about serious issues to resolve for truth, but to be entertaining, to be provocative, entertaining, and after people had had a few drinks, to get them to argue half drunkenly about whatever the issue was, as a form of verbal jousting and entertainment rather than as a form of philosophical discourse. And the Pharisees, who are not invited, will ironically play that part and generate some conversation, as we'll see in just a moment. The image of the triclinium invites us to understand how it is that the Pharisees and their scribes can see what's happening while plainly not being at the table, not only because they aren't invited, but because they plainly don't want to be associated with people who eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners. So the triclinium shows you how people could easily see from the outside, which is part of the point, to be a status symbol that shows off, see what a fancy meal we're having, and you're not part of our social world here. So the Pharisees and scribes are watching, continuing to following Jesus after he had forgiven the sins of the weakened man, described in most translation as paralyzed. And one might think their question was simply a factual question, asking for Jesus' theological or other understanding of why it's okay to eat with tax collectors and sinners, but this word suggests that it's hardly neutral. So gangazu was the verb specifically known as complaining, associated with complaining or grumbling in the wilderness. And as you can see from my notes below, Exodus and Numbers and many other places. And with no small irony, the only other use of this word, as you can see on my note from 15:2, we see here. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So that's from chapter 15, and that will set up the stories of the lost, as we'll look at briefly in a different context in a minute, and especially the story of the father and the two sons, often called the prodigal son story. So this is chapter 5. By chapter 15, they're asking the same question again, or at least not asking it as a question, at least grumbling about it. So they've not accepted Jesus' answer, even though we don't hear them reject Jesus' answer here or argue at all. They address the question to Jesus' disciples, which is the first time we're hearing of the term disciples. No one has been called a disciple yet. We saw that Levi got up to follow, but the word disciple wasn't associated with it. It's the first of 36 times used in Luke, and it would be fitting for Luke's audience because the word mathetas here simply means student. So the author of the gospel, known as Matthew's gospel, is simply describing himself as a student or as a disciple here. And so Luke introduces this term expecting his audience understands, and so that's probably to expect they understand not in a Jesus sense, but in a Greco-Roman sense of the various schools that would be around with teachers. And of course, that was a form that the early Greco-Roman church took in the 2nd century in places like Alexandria under the supervision of people like Clement or Origen, who understood themselves as teachers with students gathering around them to learn, to gather their wisdom. So the Pharisees say to the disciples, and this is the first time we know of any group, and we don't know who's in this group. We've only seen Simon, James, and John, the fishing people, and Levi called to follow. Are there more we don't know of? We don't know. And the question is this: why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Recall from when we introduced the Pharisees before the previous scene, I was noting how the characterization in the Gospels and what many people nowadays have in their minds of the Pharisees is more of a cartoon version than an accurate one. But their question here fits the real Pharisees, which is to say the word Pharisee from the Greek means separatists, people who are separate from other people, not out of a sense in our world of racism or xenophobia as such, but out of a sense of a purity that they understand Yahweh demands in order for the Messiah to come. In other words, since the people are generally not following the Torah in their perspective and in many different ways, if they, on behalf of Israel, follow the Torah, perhaps that will be good enough as a faithful remnant to get God to send the Messiah. So that's what they're doing here, but of course they would prefer that everybody who'd understand themselves as being within the people of Israel would do that, and especially someone who's presenting himself as a teacher or some kind of leader who's eating with precisely the people the Pharisees understand have to be separated from for the Messiah to come. So they ask this question directly: why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? The phrase for eating and drinking here you can see is many times in Luke, and if you correlate the bottom left corner there of my screen with the eating and drinking note with the right side with the meal scenes, we'll see they're almost identical. Similarly with the question of the house, Levi gave a grand banquet in his house, and we see how these passages, other than 4:38, which we just saw, the previous scene, and the one we're just looking at, involve in 8:51. So in the house, and the Pharisees outside the house, asking him, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? The question of who you eat and drink with would have been a question, of course, not just for the Pharisees from a Torah perspective, from a Torah purity perspective, but from Luke's audience's perspective. And we'll see it raised many times in Luke's gospel. And we'll see the implication that his audience is the elite when he tells them things like, when you host a banquet, don't invite your rich friends and neighbors who will reward you by inviting you back, but invite the poor and the blind and the lame, etc., who cannot repay you. So he's certainly aiming this at people who have the option, like Levi does here, to invite whoever they want. But Levi is doing what Jesus wants, and the Pharisees are complaining about it. The combination tax collectors and sinners, we'll see again that Jesus is described as a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and then again the scene in chapter 15 that I just referenced where the Pharisees are again grumbling about the same thing. We can note that in our passage in chapter 5, we've seen both. Peter described himself as a sinful man, and the person who was weakened or paralyzed had his sins forgiven, so that would make him no longer a sinner, and Jesus didn't eat or drink there, but he's certainly hanging around with these kinds of people. So Jesus deflects the question from his disciples. That's an honor and shame issue there. So helping them not avoid the dishonor of not having an answer to the question. After all, why would they have an answer? We don't know any teaching Jesus has done for these people yet. That won't come till the Sermon on the Plain in chapter 6, as we'll see. So Jesus answered, those who are well, and the word here is related to our English word for hygiene, those who are well, have no need, kriya here, which is a very common word you see in Luke, highlighting, as we'll see throughout, things that people need from God, not just general needs. And for the second time, we're hearing of a healer, described here as a physician, which, as I noted back in the Nazareth sermon, where Jesus is reflecting on his having read the Isaiah 61 Jubilee passage and saying, you will quote me the proverb, physician, heal yourself. I noted that the word iatro is not like our medical doctor with an MD and a white coat and a stethoscope, but any range of healers, from a shaman to someone who might have actually had some Greco-Roman knowledge of biology. But whoever that is, the people that Jesus come to need one, and those who don't need Jesus. And he describes them as sick, but literally the word is kakos, doing badly. And that can imply biological illness, but any kind of doing badly. And so, as we noted when we looked at the language of healing also a few videos ago, and the chart is posted about that too, we're recognizing that there's no line in this context between biology and other kinds of healing. The various kinds of exclusions that people have, as we'll see throughout Luke, whether it's because of poverty or illness or disability, are what Jesus has come to make into a Jubilee release here, and no longer to continue to oppress them. And then he concludes in this section here with, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And rather than look at the individual examples you see in my note corner in the lower left of uses of righteous, I produced this chart that I hope will illustrate some of the theme that's going on here in terms of righteousness, or as I prefer, justice. So there's three Greek words that are at issue here. Dikaioi for righteousness or justice sometimes. Dikaiosune, which is actually relatively rare in Luke, and dikaio, which is the verb to be justified. And so I'm just going to run through these briefly. We see where our passage is here to see the range of things that are going on here. Because the word righteousness can carry bad connotations in our world because we often associate it with self-righteousness. And the good news is, we'll see in a moment, that Jesus plainly is not affirming self-righteousness, but righteousness that comes from following Jesus and being faithful to God. So we see that our entire gospel is framed with people who are described as just or righteous. Elizabeth and Zechariah, and also Simeon, and at the end, Joseph of Arimathea, a good and just man. So Jesus' ministry is done within a framework of good Israelites who are just according to God, despite the hostility of many that we'll see. And we'll just run through these briefly. And I've highlighted in bold just enough so that you can get the theme of what's going on. So the prophecy here that Jesus will turn the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, and that people might serve him, this is God, without fear, in holiness and justice. Holiness and justice together, something that in our world are often not paired, but need to be, and we'll see more of that as we go. And we saw Simeon, and then what we saw just now, not to call the just but sinners to repentance. And then we see in chapter 7, a little later, an acknowledgement of this here. All the people had heard, including tax collectors, acknowledged the justice of God. And in that same section we hear Jesus say, wisdom is justified by all her children, which is to say, if the question of Jesus' wisdom is on the line, wisdom is made to look right by the behavior of those who claim God's wisdom. And of course, we'll look at that when we get there. And then we get to the person that sets up the Good Samaritan story, the lawyer wanting to justify himself. He asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And of course, that's something that Jesus will reject. He will turn the question around from who is my neighbor to how to treat a neighbor. And Jesus challenges people, why do you not judge for yourselves what is just? Not that they should use their own judgment, but they should understand God's judgment from the covenant and their whole history. In one of the scenes that I just referred to about inviting people to your banquet, Jesus notes, your rich neighbors cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. And one of the first times we're hearing the issue of resurrection of the just, echoing Daniel 12 there, as again we'll see. In the three stories about the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, we see this statement which really expresses the entirety of what we're going on here. There will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons who need no repentance. And so Levi obviously representing precisely one sinner who repents. In contrast, he says precisely to the Pharisees here, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. And he gives a parable about something very similar, using a Pharisee as an example of one who trusted in themselves that they were just and regarded others with contempt. So the double issue there, not only are they self-justifying, but then they look down on people that they have judged as not just from their mind. And the flip side of that is a few verses later, this man, the one who was humble and simply said, have mercy on me, a sinner, went down to his home justified rather than the other. When Jesus is challenged by the elite in Jerusalem, when he finally arrives at the end of the long journey to Jerusalem from Luke 9 to 19, we see this. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be just in order to trap him. So we see examples of false justice or pretend justice. And at the flip side of that is, ironically, the Roman centurion who supervises the crucifixion after Jesus dies proclaims, certainly this man was just. And to have that witness from a Roman centurion is really quite a statement at the end. And then finally, as we saw, a good and just man named Joseph. So at the end of this scene, we're seeing a lot that, now that we're in the middle of chapter 5, near the end of chapter 5, links each of these individual scenes to what's gone before and comes after. Not only in relation to Jesus' ministry of Jubilee, but in relation to the Pharisees as resistance to it. And we'll continue in the scene in verse 33 next time, where they ask another question as they switch the question from who you eat with to whether you should eat or drink at all. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.